Hold on.
Your review, I'm gonna react to the incredibly sad downfall of Ferguson. Okay.
Brother, I'm crying.
I wish I was able to release this video under
Ferguson, my fault. Pronounced that wrong.
Their circumstances.
but Tony Ferguson this past weekend was arrested for driving under the influence and crashing and rolling over his truck. One person was injured and he destroyed 2 parked cars and reportedly had passengers in his vehicle. It was also reported that Tony was uncooperative when officers came to question and reeked of alcohol and had bloodshot eyes. This, along with his waning career in the UFC, has been one of the saddest downfalls for a long time.
Damn, he taking mad L's. Taking mad L's, bro. In recent years.
I'm fan favorite.
So how did we get here? So let's go back to the beginning. Tony got his start in the UFC through the Ultimate Fighter and was famously picked up by Brock Lesnar. With Brock as his coach, he would run through the tournament knocking out
Brock Lesnar. You know, Brock Lesnar. He's about to face Cody Rhodes in Night of Champions.
Everyone he came across.
Though as electric and violent as he was inside the octagon, he could be as electric and violent outside of it. In an infamous moment in one of the tough episodes, Tony gets drunk inside the team house and picks a fight with one of his teammates when water was poured on his head. It was literally a harmless joke.
Bugging. Pour water inside his head.
But given how
Hammered Tony was, he tackled his teammate Charlie Rader and would refuse to shake his hand when Charlie wanted to make sure things were cool. Then Tony would bring the situation from 100 to 1,000 as he would bring up the guy's son, who at the time was in a custody battle. Obviously, teammates got involved and it was a big situation, but it's insane how Tony was able to turn up this situation from a harmless joke. Anyways, Tony would go on to win the entire tournament when he knocked out Ramsey Nijem with a left hook in the very first round. However, the Ultimate Fighter would show a different, more unhinged, more uncontrollable side of Tony that we would see later in his career. With this Ultimate Fighter win, he would officially sign with the UFC and have a hot start to his career with a TKO win against Aaron Riley and a decision win over Eve Edwards. Though in his next fight, he would be outclassed by Michael Johnson, who kept consistently landing hard shots on Tony, and it just seemed like he was just a half step quicker than Tony. Though after this loss, he would go on a monster 12-fight winning streak and define what many fans knew him for, his extreme violence. If you haven't already, please watch this video by the UFC that details his 12-fight winning streak.
I saw at one point he had a 12-fight winning streak. So at one point he was unstoppable, bro. Who's that nigga? Cause I never heard of Tony Ferguson. Ferguson, my fault. I never heard of him till now.
and you will
Truly appreciate Tony's prime. Some of the momental fights in this win streak include a rear naked choke over Gleison Tebow, the bloody affair and eventually submission of Edson Barbosa, the famous triangle choke on Kevin Lee, and gaining the interim lightweight belt because of it, and my personal favorite, super bloody back and forth against Anthony Pettis that would go on to be the fight of the year in 2018. Both guys showed a lot of heart despite taking a lot of damage, and this fight also included this iconic moment when both guys' face were cleaned of blood and they both smiled at each other as they were about to continue the round. This fight would eventually stop when Anthony Pettis' corner threw in the towel after they found out that Pettis had injured his right hand, and so Tony would get a monumental win over a former champion in a back and forth battle. And finally, this win streak would be capped off with a brutal one-sided beatdown of Cowboy Cerrone, and this fight would have...
Nah, that elbow looks sick, bro. I ain't gonna lie. That it looks deadly, bro. It looks wild deadly. I ain't gonna lie.
eventually stop when
Cowboy's right eye would shut completely. During this time, I remember this picture circulating around the UFC community,
depicting Tony's last
7 opponents, and it looked like an absolute horror show. Also during this time, Tony quickly
became a fan favorite.
outside of the octagon, given his really weird personality and very memorable quotes such as, quote, "This is a rat race, but I'm no rat. I'm a fucking turtle, Ninja Turtle. So which one is your favorite? I like Michelangelo. Next question." Also another classic, quote, "Shut up before I ankle pick you." And in the same interaction, quote, "Hold on, I'm talking, brother." Obviously, with these quotes, Tony would be a massive meme in the community, and easily still is. Anyways, with this bloody win streak, the fans agreed that Tony was due for his title shot against Khabib, and now we get into the headache that is Tony versus Khabib. one of the greatest UFC fights that ever happened, despite so many attempts. So okay, we're going to try to go through this quickly since it's a long saga of someone getting injured, or COVID stopping the fight, or something happening to prevent the fight. So shout out this ESPN timeline that we'll go through right now. So let's start with 2015. Khabib and Tony was first set when they were just contenders, with Tony being in the middle of his monster win streak and Khabib obviously still being undefeated. However, Khabib would have to pull out due to a rib injury. 2016, Tony versus Khabib is set, but this time Tony pulls out due to a lung injury, citing fluid and blood in his lungs. 2017, Tony versus Khabib is booked for a third time for the interim title, while Conor is away fighting Floyd Mayweather. But again, Khabib would pull out due to hospitalization before weigh-ins, literally a day before the fight. 2018, for a fourth time, the fight is booked, but in a ridiculous turn of events, I swear I'm not making this up, Tony trips over an electrical cord while he was in the Fox studio and ruptures his LCL. 2019, Khabib vs. Tony is set for a fifth time, but guess what year it was set for? 2020. Because of the pandemic, Khabib was locked in Dagestan, Russia due to Russia's travel restrictions. So in 2020, with no crowd, Tony was set to face Justin Gaethje for the time being, and unfortunately for Tony, this would be the beginning of the end. Tony would come into this fight with Justin, a pretty sizable favorite at minus 200, and most fans thought this was going to be a good fight against top contenders, but ultimately Tony would come up on top and would be set to face Khabib once Khabib could travel again to unite the belts. But Justin would have different plans, coming out hot in this fight, swinging everything in his punches and landing consistently on Tony. Though Tony would have a few good moments in this fight, it was Justin that had the timing and the range throughout the entire fight. Justin put a boxing clinic on Tony's head, and eventually in the fifth round, when Tony got hit hard and started shaking his head, the ref stepped in for the standing TKO. This was definitely a big loss to Tony, considering this would effectively end his chance at fighting Khabib for the real belt, as Justin would go on to do so. But not all hope was lost, as Tony was still regarded as a top lightweight, and with a win in his next fight over a rising Charles Oliveira at the time, Tony could easily come back into title contention. Tony was a slight favorite coming into this fight at around minus 130. Obviously, this was before we knew what Charles would be later capable of, and many thought Tony would get a good win over a rising star. But Charles would show he was champ material and essentially dominate Tony, and practically almost broke Tony's arm with an armbar. Charles had the perfect hyperextension on Tony's arm, but Tony refused.
I would tap out too. Bro. I'm not breaking my arm, bro. Gotta save my arm. Safety.
To tap. Though this toughness would not result in a win, as Charles would go on to win in a very dominant decision. So again, in Tony's next fight, he was set to face Beneil Dariush, another guy many thought would help Tony get back in title contention with a win. But Beneil, like Charles, would dominate this fight in a grappling affair, and again, Tony would be caught in a normally fight-ending submission and a nasty heel hook. Tony even winced in pain, and definitely something did tear, as Tony could not stand on that leg properly. And though Tony would continue the fight and make it to decision, Beneil would win in that decision. Tony in the following year was set to face Michael Chandler, this time the underdog. But despite this, Tony came in the fight looking like Tony of old, especially in the first round. He looked sharp and his volume was back, as he landed many shots while Michael Chandler was trying to find that one big shot. He even cut Michael Chandler off his back when Michael went for a takedown. But I think everybody knows how this ends. In the second round, Michael would land one of the most shocking KOs I've ever seen, with a perfect front kick down the middle, right on the money. Tony has long been known for having one of the toughest chins and from the submission
attempts from Charles and Beneil, he's simply known as one of the toughest guys in the UFC, period. So to see Tony not only get knocked out but slept like that really confirmed that this was the end for Tony altogether. Finally, Tony would go on to fight Nate Diaz in a really weird event. Tony was actually supposed to fight Li Jingliang, but due to Khamzat missing weight, Tony faced Nate Diaz in Nate's last fight. On paper, it was a cool matchup between two fan favorites, but they were both old and way past their prime, and it made for a really weird fight between the two. Eventually, Nate would find Tony in a guillotine and bring an end to a really weird event and bring an end to his career. And for Tony, this could have been a decent end to his career as well, though this is not the end of this video. So let's go back to 2019. Tony had a restraining order put on him when his wife claimed that Tony was acting violently in their house, throwing and dismantling things. The call Tony's wife Christina made is on TMZ and is pretty scary. His wife kept warning the operator that Tony was a professional fighter and she did not want any cops to get hurt. And overall, she was just very concerned of his out of character.
The cops don't care about that. The cops don't care about that, you know. But cops have protection. The boys have protection. They don't care that this nigga Tony is a UFC fighter. Like, they don't care about that.
Her behavior.
He even claimed that he poured holy water on top of her.
Cops care who you are. Like, they don't care about. Do you think the cops care about him being a professional fighter? No, I doubt they care about that.
More details would emerge around this event as his wife would go to TMZ and reveal that Tony had been suffering from manic behavior and paranoia. He even called his son Jesus Christ and called himself the second Jesus Christ. Now, I definitely want to stress that unlike some of the other domestic calls we've seen from other UFC fighters, Tony was non-violent towards his wife and kids, but his manic, out-of-character behavior is what led to the restraining order, though it would be later dropped the same year. And now we get to today. Tony has just recently been arrested for driving under the influence, crashing and rolling over his truck while destroying two parked cars in the process. Currently, his bail is set for $30,000 and his court hearing is set on June 1st. It's clear Tony has been dealing with a lot of demons. It sucks because Tony has been a huge fan favorite, a big favorite of mine, and it seemed like he was a really weirdly likable guy, though the darkness was hidden behind those wins. According to his wife, he's been suffering from this type of behavior all the way since his win in The Ultimate Fighter, so he's literally been experiencing these type of demons throughout his entire career. I really truly hope that Tony gets the help he needs, as he's clearly suffering from something much, much deeper. And again, I truly wish him well. Anyways, what do you got?
Let me know what y'all think of him, bro. Like, and tell me what is your favorite fight of Tony Ferguson. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe. Y'all know the vibes. We're checking out you, bro.